Was W.D. Farad inspired by the Theosophical Society? So, what is the Theosophical Society? This was a group that was founded in the late 19th century by this woman, Helena Blavatsky. Blavatsky was a Russian aristocrat and a mystic, and she created a group that was kind of fusing some occult elements of Christianity as well as Neoplatonism and bringing in texts from Buddhism, Hinduism, Kabbalah, Taoism. And for a lot of Americans and others, this was a first look at many of the Eastern religions and the more mystical traditions that we find in Asia and elsewhere. The group promised to promote universal brotherhood of humanity without distinction of race, creed, sex, caste, or color. And it was a post-spiritualist. So spiritualism was in the mid 1800s. That was the obsession with ghosts and mediums and seances. But this was pre-New Age. Okay, so New Age would be like 1960s boomers. You can think of the Theosophical Society as the prototype to the New Age movement. Now, there are some important differences between the teachings of Master Farad Muhammad and the Theosophical Society. For one, Master Farad Muhammad was not, quote, one thing. He was not a simple Ahmadiyya or a Buddhist or a, Sunni Muslim or Shia Muslim. He wasn't a Jehovah's Witness. He was someone that pulled teachings from various groups. He was very much his own man with his own views and his own religion, in a sense. He did not teach life after death, reincarnation, or karma like other religions do. And in this case, the Theosophical Society has these beliefs. And also Farad's attitudes towards whites and Hindus, he was hostile towards them. He believed whites were the devil. He believed or taught that if you saw a Christian and a Hindu walking together, kill the Hindu first, at least according to Elijah Muhammad in the Theology of Time. This was the teaching of Farad. Now, here are some similarities. In the Theosophical Society, there is the belief in seven root races. So, humanity evolved over a process, and the first two root races were these ethereal beings that were not fully physical. But the first physical beings were the Lemurians. And yes, the later Lemurians were considered dark-skinned, and they were associated with Africa and Black people. So you can see over here, Negro. Okay, this is the third root race. And then later you would get the Aryans, okay, which would include some of the European races. So in that sense, yes, the black man comes before the white man. The black man is first. Farad would have a similar teaching. Now, keep in mind that in the 1920s, this out of Africa thesis was already in full swing. Darwin believed that humans emerged out of Africa. In 1924, you had the discovery of the Tong child, which was the first Australopithecus africanus discovery of this hominid, and that was found in Africa. And so this was all, culminating in the time that Farad would be active. This idea that humanity starts in Africa. And of course, the black man being first taught in Theosophy on some level. There is also the belief that darkness came first, that there was this vast darkness in both the Nation of Islam and in Theosophy. So keep in mind that in the 1920s, prior to Lemaitre and prior to Hubble and prior to the discovery of the redshift, cosmologists believed that the universe was eternal. They didn't believe in the Big Bang. And so when Blavatsky would talk about the beginning, she would talk about darkness. And we know in the Nation of Islam, darkness is this primordial substance that precedes the creation, and it even precedes God. So in the Theology of Time, Elijah Muhammad teaches that that he emerged and that he created himself out of total darkness, and that in that vast darkness there was the darkness, it's not completely empty. There is some potentiality in it. So there's this fine atom of water, which the God would create himself out of. Um, the God is referred to as the One, right? Which we see in Neoplatonism, which is a big influence in Theosophy. And the One at this point is just called It, with a capital I in the Theology of Time in the written version of that book. Um, and yes, God is the black man. So, coming out of that darkness, that primordial darkness. And sometimes this is connected to the Quranic verse on the triple darkness of the womb, that the darkness is a type of a womb with potentiality that brings forth God. Now, here it is in the Secret Doctrine with Blavatsky, darkness alone filled the boundless all, right? And then The one breathed breathless by itself. This is from Blavatsky. For Blavatsky, darkness is the absolute. It's beingness before differentiation, before motion, before manifestation. This part about motions in common with Elijah Muhammad. It's this abstract space that precedes matter. It's where all potentiality lies. And so it's not chaos and it's not void. It's this, womb in which potentiality exists. And she even uses that language of infinite bism of duration and womb of the universe, and darkness as the father mother. It's this infinite darkness. And even for Blavatsky, the gods of darkness precede explicitly the gods of light. Okay, which he says right here. Secondly, there's the idea of, I don't know if we're second or third, but the idea of 12 scientists or ascended masters, in some cases 24 scientists. There was this belief in the 1920s, and even prior in Blavatsky's writings, that there were these ascended masters, that there was this council. Sometimes it's called the Great White Brotherhood. Okay, for her it was white, it wasn't black. But this was a council of higher beings. These were human beings that directed the spiritual evolution of mankind. Again, very similar to the idea of the 12 scientists who are also at the wheel of time and are writing the scriptures for humanity. So it says the world is guided, and this is in the book by Annie Besant and C.W. Leadbeater, who were neo-theosophists writing in the 1920s. Again, this is during Farad's milieu. This is during, just before he founded the Nation of Islam. He says, quote, the authors say, quote, "The world is guided and directed to a large extent by a brotherhood of adepts, to which our masters belong. Theosophical students make all sorts of mistakes about them. They often regard them as a great monastic community, all living together in some secret place. They suppose them sometimes to be angels, and many of our students have thought they were all Indian or that they resided in the Himalayas. None of these hypotheses is true. There is a great brotherhood, and its members are in constant communication with one another, but their communication is on a higher plane, and they do not necessarily live together. As part of the work, some of these great brothers, whom we call masters of the wisdom, are willing to take pupil apprentices and teach them, etc. They form only a small section of the mighty body of perfected men. Remember, even for Farad, the black man is God, and all black men have the God potentiality, but that there are these higher ascended masters, these scientists. And among the scientists, there's one head, right? So there's one Allah in person for the Nation of Islam. And even in this book by P. Pavri, 1924, The Coming World Teacher, there's this idea of, yes, the inner spiritual government has its head like any other government, and he rules not humanity alone, but all the visible and invisible kingdoms of earth, mineral, vegetable, animal, and human kingdoms, and beyond. Okay, so there's one head of that spiritual council. Cyclical time. So Matthias Cardell, in his book In the Name of Elijah Muhammad, page 183, he notes the similarity that in the nation, Madame Blavatsky and the Theosophists held a racial theory on human evolution combined with a notion of cyclical time. As does the NOI, Blavatsky believed that history moved in cycles of 25,000 years. Remember that in the Supreme Wisdom, everything happens in 25,000 year cycles. Well, that's called the Great Year in Theosophy. It's also called precessional cycles in astronomy. And in Theosophy, it was 25,920 years, which is very close and very similar to the 25,000 year cycles in the Nation of Islam. And different theories, different scholars have speculated on the origin of the 25,000 years. So Carl Evans suggests that it was borrowed from Hinduism in the book Chameleon. John Andrew Morrow suggested that maybe it comes from the Yazidis or the Ismailis, and you can find that in his book, W.D. Farad, Unveiling the Identity of the Founder of the Nation of Islam. Remember that the Great Year is an astronomical concept, an astrological concept, so it's not surprising to find variations of this in different parts of the world because they're all commenting on, physical phenomenon that everybody can observe in different periods of time. Now, everyone who has listened to the story of Yaqub knows that Elijah Muhammad speaks about germs, and he speaks about germs in a very peculiar way. He talks about humans specifically black people having a black germ and a brown germ, and that Yaqub was able to manifest the brown germ into lighter skinned people in his 600-year experiment. And so people have always wondered, like, why are we calling these germs exactly? Well, germ is terminology used in theosophy. Okay, so in the secret doctrine, Blavatsky says a germ exists in the center of every atom and needs collectively form the germ. Okay, so it is a metaphysical or spiritual concept more so than biological, but Elijah Muhammad would take, these teachings as a more physical phenomenon. The idea that there is fire in human life. So remember that for the Nation of Islam, the sun is the first creation. And after it says, quote, in the Theology of Time, after the sun, other gods were born, and they caught up the same idea, make something out of fire. Where did the fire come from? Everything is full of fire. I am full of fire. You are full of fire. Elijah Muhammad. The Theosophists, the Neo-Theosophists, like Leadbeater, who died in 1934, explicitly say that each solar system is an expression of the Logos, and that every life in each system comes from that divine fire or the solar deity. And you can find that in his book, A Textbook of Theosophy. Now, Farad also taught that there would be seven angels or seven brothers. These were scientists that were set for the destruction of the white man. And yeah, sometimes they're called angels. They control the forces of nature, and it's the job of these seven to destroy the white world, and that it would be an easy job for any one of them. So you could look at Alam Khan's channel, Alam Khan publication, Seven Angels, where you can get the full teaching from Elijah Muhammad on these seven. Now, what's interesting is that in Theosophy, you also have seven rays or seven angels of the presence, okay, or the seven Chohans. So in Alice Bailey's 1925 book, A Treatise on Cosmic Fire, there are these seven centers of forces, and they're also called seven heavenly men. And you can find more in the Secret Doctrine and in Alice Bailey's book. Now, where could have Farad learned about Theosophy? So you can see that there's a lot of similarities, and some of these similarities are too close to be a coincidence. Now, nobody disputes that Farad was in California at some point. So remember that in that Elijah Muhammad interview with Buzz Anderson, he said that Farad had studied at the University of California and that he had lived in California. We also know this in Wakil Allah's book, that Farad would visit California even in the 1930s. And academics, researchers like myself know that Farad lived in California after 1917, and that he would only leave California in 1930, basically, is when he starts to show up in Chicago and Detroit. So remember that California was basically the kind of headquarters for the Theosophical Society. So if you were living in California in the 1920s, it would have been very easy to find a Theosophical presence and learn about it. Um, those of us who subscribe to the theory that Wallace Ford is Wallace Farad, which again, I have a video on that on my channel, we know that there was this inside the prison at San Quentin where Farad was incarcerated. There was a huge Theosophical Society presence. So we know this from the book Grimhaven by Tasker. This was a book published in 1928, and it was written by an inmate that was actually in the prison at the same time that Master Farad was in the prison. Now, he never actually mentions W.D. Farad, but he does write about Theosophy being perhaps the most common of the neo-religious cults. Okay, so it was a very popular group in the prison. Carl Evans points our attention to a person by the name of George Farr. Now, George Farr was an Indian-looking man who was a member of the UNIA in California in 1920s, around the time that Farad was set to be in California and set to be with a quote-unquote Chinese American Edward Donaldson, who we would later learn was actually native. But at the time, the government was spying on the UNIA, and they had come across this person who was talking about uh, forming an Asiatic union against the white men. And his language kind of very much resembles Farad. Now, I should say that this is speculation, this part, because we don't really know if George Farr was Master Farad Muhammad. He was described as stout, which Farad wasn't described as stout. but he is active in the same time and place, and he's speaking a little bit like Farad. So this is one of the question marks. And George Farr is almost certainly an alias because we couldn't find the historical George Farr. I mean, this was probably a fake name, but we know, according to Evans, that George Farr was involved in the Theosophical Society. And that he was an advance man for a theosophical mystic named Mohini Chatterjee, okay, who was financed allegedly by the Theosophical Society leader, Madame Blavatsky. So it's possible that this was Farad and that he was involved in both the UNIA and the Theosophical Society in the 1920s, but Allah knows best. Okay. Conclusions. So many of these parallels between W.D. Farad's teachings and those of occult Western movements were under our noses all along. Now, the thing is, Theosophy, although it was a very big part of Farad's zeitgeist in the 1920s, 1930s, its popularity declined very soon after Farad disappeared in 34. And so its teachings are very seldom understood by researchers and by scholars and by laymen in the nation. So this may have been the first video where you even heard about the Theosophical Society. And a lot of the teachings which seem strange to us in the Nation of Islam were not so strange at that time because of the similarities with the Theosophical Society. Now, Theosophy appealed to a lot of upper class, upper middle class, whites, educated people, free thinkers, forward-thinking people. It appealed to women, but it would be marred by schism and very bizarre claims. And then there would be a failed world teacher episode where they had groomed this guy, Krishnamurti, to be the world teacher, but then he would later leave the organization and renounce it. Now, by the 1930s, Theosophy was also no longer a best possible explanation or best available explanation for reality because we had discovered things like the Big Bang, modern physics, psychoanalysis. Other things came and replaced Theosophy as an explanation for reality, including comparative religion and academia, Marxism and other political ideologies, and also more faithful forms of Hinduism and Buddhism, because Blavatsky did plagiarize and she sometimes misrepresented these Eastern religions, and people decided to just go to India or China themselves and to learn more about them in firsthand. Now, Theosophy, although it kind of dies as an organization, it gets absorbed into New Age and into New Thought and into UFO religions and into the I Am movement in Chicago after 34. So there's very few people who are actually quite literate in Theosophy. Even me, I wouldn't consider myself an expert in it. And so it's sometimes hard to detect teachings of Theosophy in the teachings of Master Farad Muhammad. But we can appreciate that Master Farad Muhammad basically brought this theosophy, which was pretty much inaccessible to these poor black people. So he was able to bring, and just like the Shriner influences, he was able to bring knowledge of pop science, of history, and also of these upper middle class and upper class occult societies. And it was reserved for this group of people. And then he was able to bring it down to these undereducated and destitute black people during the Great Migration and the Great Depression. So while Farad lived something of a double life, at least we can say that he shared some of the fruits of his white life, quote unquote, with his black students. Thanks for watching. I mentioned a few of the books during this presentation. First of all, you could pick up my book, W.D. Farad, The Man, Myth, and Mystery Behind the Nation of Islam, where there's a chapter on theosophy. You could look at W.D. Farad's First Footsteps in America by Anton Beatty, and also The Supreme Wisdom Lessons, A Scripture of American Islam by Michael Muhammad Knight. And of course, check out John Andrew Morrow's Finding W.D. Farad book, which is the prequel to my book with him. You can also buy me a coffee. Again, it takes a lot of time for these to put these videos together. So I'd really appreciate any support that you can spare, and that would encourage me to produce more videos and put out more research, inshallah. So with that, I bid you all farewell. Thanks for listening. Assalamu alaikum.